Welcome to math class. Today we're going to be talking about fractions and tenths and hundredths. The last time that we had a chat, we talked about this, how we could say that some tenths in one whole piece could be represented as decimals. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about these fractions here and how each of these represents one part of this whole being shaded in. And what we're going to do today is we're actually going to see what happens if we have that still one piece, but instead of only being broken up into tenths, what would happen if we broke each of those tenths, each of these bars here, into 10 smaller pieces? And what we would have here is 10 across the top and 10 along the side, meaning that it's 10 groups of 10. And we know from multiplication that 10 groups of 10 is 100. That means that what we're dealing with here is hundredths. Now, what I can do to start off is I can take a highlighter and I can show you this is what a tenth looks like. That is 1/10. And the way that I would represent that tenth is I would take one of these, and I know that each of these sections down here on the number line are going to be tenths, and they will represent what we're shading in along the top there, or in the, we called it a waffle last time. Let's stick with waffle or chocolate bar. Either one will work. And we know that each one of these represents 1. Now, if I have none shaded in, that beginning of that number line, I will just have 0 tenths. But if I have 1 shaded in, I will have 1/10 shaded in. And the cool thing is, if I break that 1/10 up into 10 more pieces, I will now be dealing with hundredths, because this is still a whole piece. And the denominator, the bottom number in a fraction, just tells us how many equal shares there are going to be. And there's going to be 100 in total, but out of 1/10, how many do you think are going to be hundredths? Well, I can count them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so what I can say is, out of 100, 10 hundredths are the same or equal to 1/10. Well, I can fill in the 0 here, because if I have 0 of them filled out and there's 100 equal pieces, that'll be 0/10. Let's do a couple more. I'll use that same color and I'll fill in, there's going to be 2/10 or 20 hundredths. I'm going to fill in this one here, and I'll fill in this one here, and I'll fill in one more, so I've got half. And if you can remember from when we talked about closest to 1/2, we know that that's how many tenths. Do you remember? If I pull this out, how many tenths are filled in? There's 5/10 right there. But if I break it up into even smaller pieces, how many hundredths will that be? Take your guess now. I know that there's 100 equal pieces, and if I count them, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 hundredths, that's what it's going to look like. And it's important for us to know how to say this, 5/10 or 50 hundredths, because that's going to lead into what we're going to do next. For now, this is all we're going to do for fractions. Welcome to our talk about decimals, tenths, and hundredths. It's a continuation of our fractions talk, where we had a waffle that is over here that has been partially eaten, and we are going to say that there are 5 out of the 10 pieces of the waffle that are eaten, and so that would be called 5/10. And our further continuation of that talk was that we could break each of those tenths up into 10 more equal pieces that would be even smaller, and it would look like this. And so now we're dealing with hundredths. I filled in this number line that shows the comparison between tenths and hundredths, and if I have 2 tenths, it is equal to 20 hundredths. You can see that in my waffle here. I'll use green. I have 1/10 filled in over here, 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 1/10 filled in over here. Each column would be considered 1/10. And the way that that works for us is that if I take this away, it is still complete tenths, but if I break them up even smaller, they are now also hundredths. So we have both 5 tenths and we have 50 hundredths. Those would be considered the same. Now, in a previous video, we talked about how we can represent tenths as decimals. And today what we're going to do is we're going to fill that in again. 0 tenths can be represented as 0 and 0 tenths. 1/10 can be represented in decimal form as 0 and 1/10. The place value that is to the right of the decimal is just our tenths place value. And all we know is that decimals are smaller than 1 and greater than 0. And I'm just going to quickly fill in the rest of these tenths. This is something that we've covered in a previous video. I'll put a link in the description below. Okay, so we've got all the decimal equivalents filled in for the tenths. And you can see that there's a similarity between 6 tenths and 60 hundredths in that they both have a 6 in the numerator and they both have a 1 and 0, or a 1 and a 0 in the denominator as well. There's just more in the hundredths. What we're going to do next is how do we show hundredths? Well, if I take a look at my place value chart, I'm only going to do some of them here. I'll put my decimal right there. This here is going to be my hundredths place value. Sorry, I almost put a T there. And this is going to be my tens place value. This is going to be my ones place value. And over here, we're going to have our tenths place value. And I'll write out tenths because this is new vocabulary for us. And tenths are smaller than the ones, but they're greater than 0. This is where we would put the tenths. So if I had 0 and 8 tenths, I might put a 0 here and 8 tenths, and that's what that would look like. But if I get smaller than tenths, my next place value is going to be over here. And you might think that I'm writing out the word hundred, because over here we have 1, 10 hundredths. I'm actually going to be writing out a TH version of that. Just like in fractions, when we have the THS, it just represents a word that means smaller than 1, greater than 0. And these are going to be our hundredths. So if I have 8 tenths, what would that look like in hundredths? Well, I would put my 0 placeholder in first of all. And then I would have 8 tenths. But I want to represent it as hundredths to show that they're actually smaller pieces. What I would do in that instance is I would actually just do exactly what you see over here in the fractions, and I would write out the full 80, and as long as this place value here is being used, we would call this hundredths. So this would be 80 hundredths, this would be 90 hundredths, depending on what fraction we're actually using here, okay? Well, one final clarification that I wanted to make was each of these tenths, if they are full tenths colored in or full tenths being used, they can be compared to our hundredths decimals. And so we've got 0 and 10 hundredths. This is what that would look like. And I'll quickly fill in the rest of these. 0 and 20 hundredths is equal to 0 and 2 tenths. 0 and 3 tenths is equal to 0 and 30 hundredths. 0 and 4 hundredths is equal to 0 and 4 tenths. 0 and 50 hundredths is equal to 0 and 5 tenths. 0 and 60 hundredths is equal to 0 and 6 tenths. 0 and 70 hundredths is equal to 0 and 7 tenths. 0 and 80 hundredths is equal to 0 and 8 tenths. And 0 and 90 hundredths is equal to 0 and 9 tenths. And 1 and 0 hundredths is equal to 1 and 0 tenths. So we know that we can call certain tenths, if they're complete tenths, we can also call them hundredths, and they will be the same. So what that means is if I have 0 and 7 tenths, it is equal to 0 and 70 hundredths. If I have 0 and 9 tenths, it is equal to 0 and 90 hundredths. Over here I've got our grid again, and it can be broken up like this again to show either just tenths or tenths and hundredths. For us, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my color in and I'm going to shade in, not that, I'll use a highlighter, and I'll color in this and this. So how would you represent this, first of all, as a fraction? If I do this, does it make it easier? Right now, this is representing what? If you said 2 tenths, you are correct. And we could also put that in decimal form and say it is 0 and 2 tenths. But if I slide this grid over, what would it be then? Well, it could be these, because those are still true. Out of these 10 columns, 2 of them are filled in. So 2 tenths are still filled in. But there's another way, now that we've got it broken up into smaller pieces, we can actually call it 2 hundredths. And when I say it like that, it sounds like a fraction, 2 hundredths. And I can represent it as a decimal as well, and I can say it's 0 and 20 hundredths. Remember, if I use this place value, I now call it hundredths. Now the next step for this is going to be, what happens when I've got tenths here? 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, and then I've got a little bit less than 3 tenths. What happens then? Well, if we follow the pattern, this is what happens. I'll use a pen for this, and I'll use a red one. Well, I know I've got 1 tenth here, 2 tenths here, 3 tenths. It's still less than 1, so it's going to be a 0 here as a placeholder. And then, how many tenths do I have? Well, there's 1, 2, 3 tenths. So I can put my 3 tenths in there, but how many smaller pieces are there yet? Well, there's 5. So I can count, or I can write down 5 of the hundredths, of the little tiny pieces. There's 3 of the larger columns, and there's only 5 of the individual little squares that we call hundredths. Now if I were to count these up, 10, 20, 30, 5, that would make sense. It's 35 out of 100. It would be 35 out of 100, 35 hundredths, and I would say that 0 and 35 hundredths in decimal form. So one last thing that I want you to remember or take away from this is that tenths and hundredths are different. If I take a look at this and I say I'm going to color in 1/10 with my green highlighter, it is going to look like this. I'm filling in 1 out of those 10 columns. 1/10 is filled in. And if I say that I'm going to fill in 1/100th of this, that's going to look like this. That's it. 1 out of 100. So, which one is bigger? 1/10 or 0 and 100th? Hopefully that made sense. Please watch the video again if you're not quite sure. Make sure you're asking lots of questions, and we'll see you again soon.